The Munich Security Conference comes to an end today after a dramatic 3 days that showed fundamental rifts between the U.S. and the EU. U.S. Vice-President JD Vance accused European leaders of retreating from their values and ignoring voter concerns on migration and free speech. Vance's speech came after President Donald Trump blindsided allies in possible Ukraine peace negotiations by holding unilateral talks with Russian President Vladimir Putin. It is likely to be remembered as the week that fundamentally altered the Transatlantic alliance and reestablished U.S. ties to Russia. DW's chief international editor Richard Walker joins me now from the Munich Security Conference. Richard, has Russia's Western isolation come to an end?
Michael, yeah, so it certainly, I think I would agree with you in that introduction. There's this sense this weekend that something historic has kind of shifted, and this outreach that we're seeing now from the Trump administration towards Russia is certainly something that was not necessarily unexpected, but it has really, the pace of it, the nature of it, the messaging around it has come as something of a shock, especially kind of combined with that speech coming from JD Vance that was so sort of hostile towards the Europeans. I'm sure we'll kind of go into all of that stuff during the course of our conversation, but I think the overall sense that you have here from talking to a lot of people, a lot of Europeans, a lot of experts, politicians, is that overall this is a pretty much best-case scenario situation for the Russians at this stage. Vladimir Putin could hardly have hoped for anything better than this offer from the Americans to go straight into talks, this sense that the Europeans and even the Ukrainians are being kind of frozen out of this. This is kind of the two big men talking to each other. And this sense that the Trump administration wants a quick deal, they're even potentially prepared to make concessions before even going into these talks, or signal that they're ready to make these concessions. So I think Vladimir Putin, one former European politician said to me this weekend that he thought Vladimir Putin would have been getting drunk on champagne and caviar this weekend, and I think that's a pretty widespread belief here.
That speech by U.S. Vice President JD Vance generated the biggest reaction this year. How do you think it will go down in history?
Yeah, certainly you've had politicians, I think particularly German politicians, because they're the ones who feel most stung by this because of these messages that JD Vance put in there, implicitly supporting the Alternative for Germany, so this right-wing populist party that is second place in the polls here, where all of the other parties have said, we would never go into coalition with that party. They're too extreme on some areas for us to consider really politically cooperating with them. JD Vance explicitly saying that this, what is referred to as a firewall in German politics, saying essentially that's illegitimate. It is spurning the democratic rights of the people who support that party. That has been really stinging to the Germans. But also just this kind of this sense that there's a cultural as well as political gulf opening up between the United States and Europe. You know, in the US a lot, there's been a talk since the election of Donald Trump that there's a vibe shift, yeah? This is talked about, especially on the right a lot, that it's not just a political victory, there's a cultural victory, and it's affecting culture, it's affecting business, it's affecting tech, all sorts of areas. And I think maybe that you get an impression that JD Vance would like to see that vibe shift happening in Europe, and the Europeans are saying, wait, this is not for you to decide. We do our own politics.
There were some pretty firm rebuttals to Vance's speech, but give us a sense of the mood behind the scenes.
Yeah, well, it's been very worried, and I think combining the worry about what's happening with Ukraine and the worry about what JD Vance's message about this, this huge political and cultural difference between the US and Europe, when you combine those things, what does it mean? And I just thought, okay, to give you a sense of atmosphere here, I wanted to show you a little bit about, what this conference is like inside and where we've been, these last few days while we've been talking on all of our platforms. So just to give you a sense, this is where we've usually been standing. DW has a position with all of these media cameras that are inside the hotel here. And we look down. So if we just kind of point down here, we look down over this entrance lobby. And you see the chandelier here. It's a kind of classic, five-star luxury hotel. It's called the Bayerischer Hof in Munich, the center of the city. And this is like the kind of the bustling center of this whole conference. Whenever a really big leader arrives, it's about to happen because, security people start standing around and, a path has to be open for whether it's the US Vice President or some other very important political leader. And it can get really jammed in here. And word of something, of some kind of news or something, can spread incredibly quickly. And last year, I don't know if you remember, Michael, but the bombshell at the beginning of this conference was the death of Alexei Navalny, the Russian dissident who died in a Russian jail. This was announced on the first day of the Munich Security Conference. That news spread here like wildfire. This year, the news that the bombshell was not about anything in Russia. It was not about the death of a dissident. It was that speech by JD Vance that some people were in the hall watching it, other people were watching it on screens. And let's just walk around here a little bit. I'll just kind of show you a sense of where people gather to talk about things. So here, there is a lounge where people come in between speeches, where they come and have informal chats, where they come to exchange thoughts and impressions that they get from things. So, and in this lounge, it can be pretty amazing. I mean, you go in there and you see, there's a prime minister standing next to, sitting down next to another political leader or an expert, chin wagging with somebody who you didn't know that they knew. So this is kind of where the sort of the whole atmosphere of this event is formed. And the conversations in there were all about that speech. What did you make of it? I would walk up to a former politician or an expert or whatever and just say, Vance, what do you think? And they knew exactly what I was talking about. So, yeah, it really was a bombshell. And like I say, this sense of, a cultural, political gulf emerging between the US and Europe. And what are the implications of that? Because if there's a sense in the signals coming from Vance are, we think a greater threat to Europe than the Russian war on Ukraine or potentially threats emanating from China, that the greater threat is within European democracies. That was his message. That is something that is going to take a while for people to sink in with people. And you've had some people saying here, like, this is a fresh turning point. In Germany, there's this word Zeitenwende people talk about a lot, that which means turning point. Olaf Scholz, the Chancellor, coined it in early 2022, just soon after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. A lot of people here have been saying this is a second turning point, this of a historical level, where the US has sort of signaled it might be prepared, not just militarily, but culturally, politically, kind of spiritually, to pull away from Europe.
Richard, I have a question for you that I'm sure that you saw coming, but I also think it's a question that people are going to be asking even weeks from now. Where does the Transatlantic Alliance stand after this year's Munich Security Conference?
Yeah, so I mean, that's the question that people have been talking about in the lounge that we were just looking in there. I think people don't know yet. I mean, the weeks ahead are going to be quite crucial. You have the Europeans holding an emergency summit to talk about how they should respond to all of this coming out of the Trump administration. You have the Trump administration holding its first talks with the Russians in Saudi Arabia. We can anticipate further talks to come. We're going to have that first summit meeting between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. The signals are that could happen even pretty soon. All of these things are going to kind of play into the mix of where does this all go. I think the Europeans are hoping that the one thing that they can do to stabilize the relationship and kind of anchor Europe's position in all of this is to be able to prove to the American administration and to prove to the rest of the world that it is really taking its own defense seriously, that it is, answering those calls that have come from the Americans since long before Donald Trump, but that Donald Trump has intensified to this extent, that the Europeans can no longer free ride on American defense spending. They need to be doing more for their own defense. And I think a lot of the signals with respect to that will refer to what is the percentage of GDP, of gross domestic product, that Europe is prepared to put into defense. NATO has had this target for 10 years now of 2% of GDP. They're going to have to go far beyond that. There's talk of 3%, 3.5%. Donald Trump is demanding 5%, at least rhetorically. So that's going to be a signal that the Europeans will want to send in the next few weeks and leading towards a NATO summit that's supposed to be happening in early summer. And that will be a moment where NATO comes together and the Europeans can say, all right, this is our contribution. I think part of the hope there is that then Donald Trump will be able to take this as a kind of a victory for him, saying, look, I cajoled the Europeans into finally taking all of this seriously. And the Europeans will kind of earn their way to a seat at the table in discussions about what is going to happen in Ukraine. So I think a lot will hang on that, and a lot will hang, of course, on the kind of talks and negotiations that take place between the Americans and the Russians. If Donald Trump moves to a very quick and a kind of what might be seen here in Europe and in Ukraine as a shabby peace with Vladimir Putin, that will be very damaging towards trust between the two sides.
Richard, I'm curious, what are the takeaways for European leaders? Do they have a clear vision of what they now need to do?
Well, I mean, what we were just talking about there, moving towards that NATO summit, talking about the kind of resources that need to go into it. So that's one aspect of it. How much money are you going to put up? Another aspect of it is how are you actually going to go about the kind of rearmament and, expansion of militaries that is necessary. And that becomes a complex discussion. It's talking about how to simplify and standardize what you call the procurement, so that the ordering and purchasing of weapons for European militaries. There's a sense that many have been saying this, that there are far too many different weapon systems in Europe. It makes them incompatible, it's inefficient, you don't have enough economies of scale. So there are discussions about how to try to reduce the number of systems, to consolidate and to make that whole process more efficient. But even that is, of course, a difficult thing to do because, one country might have a defense contractor that makes this system, another country has a defense contractor that makes that system. How do you decide which of those are ones that you standardize around? So there's an awful lot of this kind of detail to work out. I think one person, if you were to think about, who do I watch to see how this all goes through? One person to watch closely is Mark Rutte. He's the former Dutch Prime Minister of the Netherlands. He's now the Secretary General of NATO. It's kind of up to him to be the real bridge and the glue between the United States and Europe on this whole question. And it's been very interesting to see his messaging because he has not been somebody who's been complaining about the messages from America. He's been very much can-do and saying to the Europeans, look, we should stop complaining about this, we should get on with it, let's get started with a fairly clear plan. So it'd be interesting to see, do the European members of NATO, do they kind of feel empowered by that? Do they share that spirit? And can they follow that spirit in a way that really brings them closer and kind of, tries to kind of repair some of that gulf that we've seen emerging this weekend between the US and Europe?
Before we go, there was a lot of talking about the war in Ukraine, about Russia, the EU, and the US. But what about China's say in all of this?
Yeah, so I think this is really fascinating. And not just China, but also other Asian countries that have been here. So, and we were saying at the beginning, this is kind of almost best-case scenario for the Russians. Yeah, I mean, Vladimir Putin is getting a situation where he's being respected. He's potentially getting a good deal, in his eyes, gaining territory in Ukraine, potentially keeping Ukraine out of NATO. Having a situation where Ukraine is so politically weakened and without much in the way of security guarantees that potentially some point in the future he can go and finish the job and take full control of Ukraine as he's always wanted to do. What about the Chinese looking on this? Well, the Chinese, of course, have got much closer to the Russians in recent years. They've been supporting Russia, at least economically and diplomatically, and also with so-called dual-use goods, so goods that could be used in their defense industrial base to help the war effort. They've always presented themselves as very neutral on the war, that they don't have any kind of skin in this game, but in that they are invested in what they see as a very large-scale competition with the United States for influence on the global level. Anything that sees Russia come out of this war in a good position, I think, is something that will be seen as good for them. And then on top of that, the bickering that we've had between the Europeans and the Americans is absolutely a dream situation for the Chinese. Because the Chinese biggest hope really has been that they can avoid the Europeans and the Americans working too closely together to kind of confront China. They want to keep a better kind of business-orientated relationship with Europe. And the more the Europeans feel under pressure from the Americans, the more bickering there is across the Atlantic, the more Europeans will be open to that. And they will look at the Chinese and think, okay, the Chinese, they may be a different system. It's a communist authoritarian system, but at least they're kind of predictable. We know where we stand with them. And that could be a very damaging kind of trend that could emerge to further erode the Transatlantic alliance. So a huge opportunity for the Chinese, and I've been talking to Chinese delegates here, and they certainly do see that opportunity. So something to watch out for will be to what extent the Chinese really try to reach out to the Europeans and improve relations with the Europeans, which have been so damaged by China's support for Russia in recent years. But I think the flip side of that is that democratic and Western allies in Asia are very worried about this situation on two fronts. They're worried about the kind of precedent that what is kind of a shabby peace in Ukraine could mean for security in Asia. For instance, the empowerment of the North Korean military that it's got out of its cooperation with Russia in that war, and concerns that Xi Jinping might look at a favorable outcome for Vladimir Putin in Europe and think, oh, well, I can go ahead and help myself to Taiwan, and I probably won't have a problem with that. So there's that level, but also there's the sense of bickering in the transatlantic alliance weakens just the network of democracies around the world. And this is something that is concerning for Asian democracies. I was speaking to representatives from one of the United States' closest allied countries in Asia last night, and they were saying they're really worried about this. A bad vibe in the transatlantic alliance is bad for democratic countries in Asia as they look to trying to deal with the challenge emanating from Russia, emanating from China in their part of the world.
Richard, thank you.